Right. Hello. Welcome. We're going to talk about the Winningers. Really interesting group of people from Marathon County, and ended up taking on a lot of significance all over, not just the Marathon County, but the wider Midwest region and beyond. So when we sit down, we have to figure out, okay, what are we going to talk about next month, right? We have to pick a topic. What things are going to be interesting that people can learn about, that people enjoy hearing about. Well, with the Winninger family, it's a little different because their legacy is not, they certainly have a legacy, but it's not a legacy that's rooted in a place name or a company that's still around. Instead, it's the legacy of the experience that they left with people. And again, not just here in Marathon County. We claim them, I think for good reason, because they are, very much associated with this community, got their start and all that sort of stuff. However, I wouldn't say that necessarily it's limited to this, because they performed all over the Midwest. As we'll see, they'll end up leaving their mark on Hollywood and the Broadway stage and all of that. But before we get into that, we need to talk about their origins. And for that, we need to talk about their parents. So Rosalina and Franz Winninger were married maybe the late 1860s in Vienna, Austria. That's where they were from. Franz was a blacksmith. That's what his day job was. And Rose was actually the daughter of a blacksmith. But they're both musical. In particular, well, so the family lore says that he was the first chair violin in Johann Strauss II's orchestra, right? The Viennese orchestra. This is like this big, probably the most famous orchestra of the day. I don't know if that's true, or if maybe that's sort of a bit of showbiz propaganda that came later. Regardless, he was a good musician for sure. Now, he gets drafted into the Austro-Hungarian army. And at that point, it's worth noting that, this is not just like getting in the National Guard. Like, they were not at war. He ended up serving in Bohemia. So little context here. There's no war. It's not like they're being drafted to fight a war, right? Instead, the military needs to have troops in place to put down potential revolts. Because you can see here, this is a map of all of the different ethnic groups that are part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This is an empire that's ruled in Vienna by the German-speaking Austrians, but there's the Hungarians and the Bohemian or Czech people. There are the Croatians and the little Italian, a little bit of Transylvanian. There's all these different ethnic groups that they are starting to think like, hey, we should be free. We should maybe not be under the heel of the Austrians. This is ultimately going to lead to the creation of World War I, basically, if you know your history of that. But at the time, there was a lot of concern about, well, if the Czechs rise up, for example, if the ethnic Czechs rise up and they decide that they want to have their own state, maybe we don't want Czech troops being in charge of putting down Czech rebellions. So we're going to actually, anybody who's been put into the military from the Bohemian area, we're going to send you to Hungary. The Hungarians are going to go to Croatia, and the Viennese in Austria are going to go to Bohemia. They're going to split that up. And that's how he ended up in Bohemia, where the first four of their children, the couple, were born here in Bohemia. And not in their native Austria. Now this is, he had it probably not so bad because he was a musician. He got put in charge of a military band. So he wasn't like on the front lines, doing that sort of stuff. Not that there was, I don't know that there was any fighting. We don't really know much about this period. What we do know is that like many American immigrants, people who came to the Americas from Germany, Austria, these places, they did not want to see their three young children, their sons, they had, and a daughter, I should say. They didn't want to see them have to get through this experience themselves, being forced into the military, and maybe there is a war when they're of age. So they end up immigrating to the United States in 1880, originally to Milwaukee, but then they end up finding out about this opportunity for land up in the Athens area. And I'm not sure specifically where in Athens. There's a little bit of, I looked at plat maps from 1882 and I couldn't find their name, but apparently they had a homestead on Black Creek. Farming isn't really their passion, right? This is something that they tried. Hey, there's an opportunity for a new life. Doesn't really work out. But while they're there, Franz is going around and he's playing with the band in Dorchester and in the Reckbach area. He's getting involved in music. And ultimately, this gives an opportunity where they go to Ashland to take over an orchestra up there. Now, Ashland is at the very northern part of Wisconsin, right? It's very early for Ashland. They're just kind of getting started. It's not exactly the center of culture and civilization. But he's put in charge of a band. I think the Bay City Orchestra, if I remember correctly. I could be wrong about the name. And he does his best to make do. And as his children come of age, they get trained as musicians and they join the family business. Eventually, they kind of split off and start touring as the Winiger family novelty or company. All the Winiger family was involved. So this is sort of the stage in, a lot of stories about great artists and musicians. There's often that stage at the beginning where they have to put in their dues, right? You got to pay your dues, you got to work some crappy jobs, you got to play some venues where people aren't interested in hearing what you have to say or listen to your music, right? And certainly the area that they were living in and touring around is some of the roughest, uncivilized places that you could ask for in Wisconsin, right? So this is an education. It's an education for specifically the children, not only in how to play music, but how to play to an audience. You can't. This isn't Vienna and the Strauss Orchestra where you sit down and play and people are going to listen. So you're going to need to keep their interest. You're going to keep things light. Put in some shtick, some comedy, right? Maybe a little bit of skits or stuff. This is the early kind of days of vaudeville, and you can see that influence and kind of like, yeah, this works for them. Ultimately, though, it doesn't pay very well. And ultimately, they end up coming back to Marathon County as touring, and they get an opportunity for some stability as the house band or the entertainment proprietors of Columbia Hall here. So Columbia Hall, it's on Grand Avenue, just south of the breweries, which you can see here. Originally, this is the location of the first beer garden in town. Back in 1880, Frank Schubert built a beer garden. That went through some changes. Ultimately, there's a fire that causes the rebuilding as Columbia Hall in 1892-93. And in response to that, they need someone to come play music here. And so, could do with some entertainment and more, entertainers in the area. And so they come and play here. And this provides some stability, some opportunity to continue on. But they are touring occasionally too. In 1898, for example, they end up going, and this is from later, but in 1898, they get an opportunity to play down in Memphis, Tennessee, which is a bit of an eye-opener, apparently. Specifically, they find out that Memphis, Tennessee, it's a growing community. It's not nothing, but they don't have a whole lot of local talent. And so they rely on groups coming through. But this is the off season that they go down there. And so they realize there's this opportunity. All these little cities and towns all over the place that could use, would welcome them coming and playing. And so in 1899, they incorporate once again as a traveling band, this time without the girls. Sister Teresa decides, she was never really comfortable with the antics that were necessary for this era of and this sort of style of music. So she ends up getting married to a local lawyer in Wausau, and they move away out of town. And their mother, Rose, stays home as well, although Franz does continue, and he kind of leads the orchestra side of things. So the sons are increasingly more actors. They're doing the other stuff. They're still playing music, obviously, but he kind of, takes over the music, directing side of things. In 1903, they reincorporate once again. This is kind of one of those things where like every year they would like reincorporate as slightly different title to their company, the comedy company or the traveling troupe or, that sort of stuff. But in 1903, they reincorporate specifically as the brothers, the Winiger brothers. And the following year, their father, Franz, is going to retire. So he stays home, ends up, staying around in Wausau for the next 16, 17 years, giving lessons and all that sort of stuff. But they continue to tour without him. Around 1906, or 1908, I should say, so about 4 years later, they're so popular that they decide to split the group. So they create two companies, one headed by Joe, Adolf, and Charles, and the other one headed by Frank and John. So they have two groups that are touring simultaneously. A little bit after that, about 1909, they actually split off and create a third one. So Joseph, who was never really like the comfortable being the spotlight. He was more of a behind the scenes guy, right? He's the guy that is going to, take care of the business side of things. And he's going to have a brief third Company C, but he's ultimately by 1910 going to be settling in Appleton, where he's going to run a theater. And he's going to spend the rest of his career, running theaters and taking care of the logistics for like traveling companies at Chicago and places like that. Also, so he may not have been popular or comfortable in the spotlight, but Charles, the youngest, was absolutely popular, and this was his calling. And so around 1910, he also leaves the company, which then creates sort of decide to bring Adolf back into the main company, and they just have once again the Winiger Brothers Company. We'll come back to this in a bit, but first I want to talk about Charles, because Charles he does go off to New York and he does make a career on Broadway. So in 1910, he has his first Broadway production that he stars, or he plays the role of Rudolph Schnitzel in a play called The Yankee Girl. Within 2 years, he's actually going to be directing Broadway productions. He does a production of a play called Wall Street Girl. And from then, it's just going to be continuing on. In 1915, he has a sort of bit role in a very short movie, a silent movie, one of those early silent movies. So he's going to be involved in the stage and the screen over the course of the 20s and 30s. Notably, probably his biggest role that he's known for in 1932, he has a title starring Rowe as Captain Andy. Sorry, Captain. There's no captain. It's Captain Andy. In the production of Showboat, which originally is on Broadway in 1932. That's really popular. He plays, reprises his role, in the reprise, the sort of reproduction of it, and also in the movie in 1936. So there he is. And it's so popular that, and this is basically, I don't know if it was written for him, but it might as well have been written for him. This is just the perfect role for him. So he not only plays it on stage and screen, he also continues as sort of the bootleg version, maybe, the Maxwell House radio production Showboat, as Captain Henry. Now, during this time in the 20s, he gets his brother, Adolf. He comes and joins him in Hollywood and works as his assistant and occasional stand-in for these sort of things. But I want to talk a little bit more about his career in Hollywood. So as an example here, let's look at Siegfried Girl, which is a 1941 MGM production in which he plays sort of a former vaudeville stage actor. And he's kind of the father of Judy Garland, who's, it's the story of her kind of becoming an actress of note. So there they are doing some dancing. His role in this is pretty interesting. This is the kind of typical of the roles that he played of somebody who has sort of a theatrical side. He sort of has that comic relief figure often, but here's kind of a more serious role that in some ways that he plays. But also it's notable because later in the production, sort of part of the big finale, they bring in and have him he's kind of playing a version of a fictionalized version of Edge Gallagher, who's a a vaudeville sort of duo along with Al Sheen. And the two of them, it's sort of like, it's one of those standard bits that come out of the vaudeville. Like there are certain things that people just do. And it's kind of like, the bit, Who's on First by Abbott and Costello. It just becomes synonymous with them, right? But when the talkies, the movies start to become a thing, they often pull from the vaudeville stage, right? So they occasionally, as in the case in the Siegfried Girl, put on basically this song and dance number that's famous with these guys. And specifically, they get Al Sheen, who's still alive at this point, to play opposite him in this scene. So let's take a look at that.
Oh, Mr. Gallagher, today I paid a visit to a gallery. Of all the statues that they show, I think Venus de Milo is the greatest in all Greek mythology.
Oh, Mr. Sheen. Oh, Mr. Sheen. Well, for de Milo's Venus, I'm not very keen.
Why not?
For the thing that spoils her charms are the pair of broken arms.
I didn't see them, Mr. Gallagher.
Where were you looking, Mr. Sheen?
So that's kind of the gist of this. This is sort of the tail end of that, the sort of humor there. But it's you know it's that Broadway, you know, or the stage, that sort of that shtick, the vaudeville sort of atmosphere. He steps into that role without much trouble at all, which I think is typical of that. And to give maybe another example of this, this is a performance in another movie from 1944 alongside Tommy Dorsey.
Styles in music always change. There's always some entirely different phase. But no matter how they change, it's not as good as in the good old days. I love corny music where the trombone blows. Yeah. I love corny music when the band all goes. Yeah. I won't say that swing.
And get the idea, I think. Yeah, so I think there's something to this about you know, this generation. Certainly the Winegers. I think this is exactly, you know, Charlie is certainly the most successful beyond you know, the local scene. But I think this is probably, from everything that I've seen, very much in line with sort of the Winegers in general. They kind of fall into this really well, and they do love their corny music, apparently. So Charlie, although he is the most, you know, popular, and he does definitely go on to do a lot of stuff, he does come back to Wausau occasionally. Maybe less so after 1920, when their father passes away, and their mother goes to live with their sister. I can't recall exactly where she is at this point, but outside of the area. But Adolf, until he goes and goes with Charlie, John and Frank here, this is them on Frank's porch. They still live in the area, even though they continue to tour. So let's talk about that. Especially after Adolf goes and works with Charles, Frank and John continue the vaudeville, or the touring that they were doing under their own the brothers company. It's actually it becomes Frank's company. So this is an example of them in 1914 when they're operating out of Menominee. Notable that even though they're in Menominee, they do give an opportunity for a lot of local people to get into the scene. I'm thinking particularly of this picture here shows three of the Legrand sisters, which is another touring group. Another fascinating story that maybe we'll have to get into in another history chats at some point. But the three of them, and there's a fourth, and I'm not sure. I don't know if this is her. I don't think so, but there were four Legrand sisters from Wausau who end up becoming vaudeville stars and actually tour under their own company for a while. But Frank goes through this period where also in 1920, his wife passes away unexpectedly, leaving him in the care of their two young children. So for a bit, he doesn't tour, but he can't not get, this is his life. It's not just his profession. This is who he is. So even after 1920, there's a year or two where he's not traveling as extensively, but yeah, he goes back on the road touring under his own company. Even in like 1928, it's weird because if you look at the newspaper records, they're 1927, 28, 29, 30, they keep announcing that he's retired, but that he goes back on the road. So I'm not sure. I think ultimately he kind of settles, though, especially after 1928, he's not touring as heavily. And a lot of his performances happen, this is his house, I mean, obviously a little later, but this is the house on Grand Avenue that he purchased and lives in. And he actually builds a theater in the background behind, an open air theater, which actually gets turned into like a beer garden later. You can't escape the German-ness of his heritage there. But he puts on productions, and his tours often end here for long periods, right? So these are a couple examples of things that he's done, including his son here ends up getting put into Rip Van Winkle starring role. And then you can see on this far one on the right, Frank, Adolf, and John. So John is still in town. He's still an actor as well. But ultimately, in 1932, he passes away. Interestingly, 1932 is also the year that John passes away, which means that Wausau is once again without a Winiger, or the Wausau area, I should say, since I guess technically he lived in Schofield, Frank did, without a Winiger. Just to kind of the building, by the way, it's not still a theater. I don't think it lasted to be a theater for very long. It gets turned into a funeral home at some point, and that's what it is today. Actually, the John Bitkin Funeral Home. I do know John, actually, through music. He's a trombone player. So I don't know if there's a coincidence there. I don't know how he feels about corny music, but, he's a trombone player. So anyway, that's the Winiger family. That's the presentation that I have put together. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for joining us. Have a wonderful week, and we will see you next time.
I love corny music.